in the golden vineyards of Chateau Vin. A grand wine tasting turns deadly when Roland Carver, the ambitious owner, collapses, poisoned by his own celebrated vintage. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster from St. Mary Mead, unraveling a web of secrets among a cast of suspects: the meticulous sommelier Marcel, the bitter former owner Evelyn, the envious rival Victor, and the nervous journalist Clara. As motives of pride, resentment, and ambition surface, Miss Marple's keen insight reveals a chilling plot to ruin the vineyard's legacy. In just 30 seconds, dive into a classic Agatha Christie mystery where every sip hides a secret, and the truth is as potent as the deadliest wine. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Chateau Vin. The quiet of her cottage in St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of a metronome. The autumn light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn rug. On the table beside her lay a letter, its crisp envelope bearing the elegant script of Lady Beatrice Harrow, a friend from her school days whose penchant for society gatherings had not dimmed with age. The letter was an invitation to a weekend at Chateau Vin, a vineyard in the Sussex countryside, recently acquired by a gentleman named Roland Carver. A splendid affair, Jane Beatrice had written, her words brimming with enthusiasm. Fine wines, charming company, and the unveiling of a new vintage that promises to be extraordinary. Do come. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp despite her years, lingered on the letter. She was not one for lavish outings, preferring the familiar comforts of her village, where the intricacies of human nature were as complex as any grand estate could offer. Yet something in Beatrice's tone, certain breathless excitement, stirred her curiosity. It was not unlike the time Mrs. Elspeth McGillicuddy had written with similar fervor, only for Miss Marple to uncover a most unfortunate incident involving a train and a strangling. Setting her knitting aside, she decided to accept, sensing that Chateau Vin might hold more than just the bouquet of a fine claret. The journey to Sussex was uneventful, the train rattling through fields burnished gold. By the season, Miss Marple, dressed in her sensible tweed coat and a hat adorned with a single feather, arrived at the small station nearest Chateau Vin, where a sleek motor car awaited. The driver, a young man with a deferential nod, spoke little, allowing Miss Marple to observe the landscape. The vineyard appeared as if conjured from a painting. Rows of vines stretched across gentle hills, their leaves tinged with russet, and beyond them stood the manor house, its gray stone walls softened by ivy. The air carried the sweet, heady scent of grapes, and a faint hum of activity suggested preparations for the weekend's tasting at the manor's entrance. Roland Carver greeted her himself. He was a man of middle age, with a lean frame and dark hair slicked back in a manner that suggested both confidence and calculation. His eyes, a striking green, met hers with an appraising glint. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as the wine he produced, "your reputation for insight precedes you. I'm delighted you could join us." There was a charm to him, but Miss Marple, accustomed to reading the subtleties of character, noted a certain intensity beneath his polished exterior, as if he were playing a part he had rehearsed too well. The entrance hall of Chateau Vin was a study in understated opulence. A chandelier of wrought iron hung above a marble floor, and a wide staircase curved upward to shadowed corridors. Carver led her to the drawing room, where tall windows overlooked the vineyards and a fire crackled in a cavernous hearth. A few guests had already arrived, their voices mingling with the clink of glasses. Beatrice Harrow, resplendent in a silk dress the color of claret, rushed forward to embrace Miss Marple. "Jane, you dear thing, isn't this divine?" she exclaimed, gesturing to the room. Miss Marple smiled, her mind already cataloguing the faces around her. A butler offered her a glass of sherry, which she accepted with a murmur of thanks, sipping sparingly as she observed. The room held the promise of secrets, much like the village hall during St. Mary Mead's annual fete, where smiles often masked rivalries. Carver moved among his guests, his laughter ringing out, but Miss Marple sensed a watchfulness in him, as if he were gauging their reactions. She tucked this observation away, knowing that the weekend, like a good wine, would reveal its true character in time. Chapter 2. The cast of characters. The drawing room of Chateau Vin glowed with the warmth of the fire, its flickering light casting long shadows across the polished oak floor. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near a window overlooking the twilit vineyards, held her sherry glass with delicate precision, her eyes moving from face to face with the quiet attentiveness of one accustomed to unraveling the tangled threads of human nature. The room buzzed with conversation, the sort of polite chatter that filled grand houses during such gatherings. Yet Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent, a faint discord beneath the clinking glasses and forced laughter. It reminded her of a tea party in St. Mary Mead, where Mrs. Bantry's overly bright smile had betrayed a domestic squabble, later revealed to involve a missing brooch and a wayward nephew. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her hostess, flitted about with the energy of a woman determined to make the weekend a success. Her dress, a deep burgundy that matched the vineyard's theme, rustled as she introduced Miss Marple to the assembled guests. "You must meet everyone, Jane," Beatrice said, her voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a society matron. "Such a fascinating group. Roland has outdone himself." Miss Marple nodded, her mild expression concealing the sharpness of her observations. Beatrice's eagerness, she noted, was tinged with a nervous edge, as if she were not entirely certain of the harmony she sought to project. The first to approach was Roland Carver himself, the vineyard's new owner. He was a man whose presence commanded attention, not through volume, but through a certain magnetic intensity. His dark hair was swept back, and his green eyes held a glint of ambition that Miss Marple found both intriguing and unsettling. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly, "I trust you're finding Chateau Vin to your liking." His smile was polished, but Miss Marple, who had seen similar smiles in the village, most notably on Mr. Grayson, the solicitor who had once swindled a widow, detected a calculation behind it. "It's quite charming," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "Though I confess, I know little of wine beyond a glass of claret at Christmas." Carver laughed, a sound too hearty to be entirely genuine. "We shall remedy that this weekend," he promised, moving on to greet another guest. Next came Marcel Dubois, the sommelier, a Frenchman whose lean frame and precise movements suggested a man who took his craft seriously. His dark suit was immaculate, and his thin mustache twitched slightly as he spoke, as if scenting the air for inferior vintages. "Mademoiselle Marple," he said, his accent clipped, yet melodic. "It is an honor to meet one so discerning." The word hung in the air, and Miss Marple wondered if he meant it as a compliment or a challenge. She smiled, tilting her head. "You are too kind, Monsieur Dubois. I imagine your work requires a keen eye for detail." His lips curved faintly, but his eyes remained guarded. "Precision is everything," he replied, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers toyed with a small silver corkscrew hanging from his waistcoat. It was the sort of restless gesture she had seen in Mrs. Price, the village seamstress. When questioned about a missing bolt of silk, as Marcel drifted away to inspect a decanter, Beatrice introduced Evelyn St. Clair, the vineyard's former owner. Evelyn was a woman in her late 50s, her silver hair swept into an elegant sheen, her posture regal, despite the faint lines of strain around her eyes. She wore a dress of deep green, its simplicity belying its cost, and her handshake was cool but firm. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and measured, "Beatrice speaks highly of you." There was a warmth in her tone, but Miss Marple detected a shadow of reserve, as if Evelyn were guarding a wound. "I'm delighted to be here," Miss Marple said. "Chateau Vin has such a storied history." Evelyn's smile tightened. "It does," she said, glancing toward Carver, who was laughing with another guest. though its future is uncertain." The words were soft, but Miss Marple heard the bitterness, like the tempts of a sour grape. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow, Mrs. Clement, whose polite demeanor had masked a deep grudge against a neighbor who had bought her family's orchard. Could Evelyn harbor a similar resentment? The next guest to draw Miss Marple's attention was Victor Langston, a rival vintner whose robust frame and booming voice filled the room. His ruddy cheeks and broad shoulders suggested a man accustomed to outdoor work, yet his tailored suit and gold cufflinks spoke of wealth. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, striding over with a glass of red wine in hand. "Welcome to the heart of wine country. What do you make of Carver's little empire?" His tone was jovial, but his eyes flicked toward Carver with a sharpness that belied his friendliness. Miss Marple smiled demurely. "It's quite impressive," she said, "though I understand your own vineyard, Langston Vale, is equally renowned." Langston's laugh was loud, but it did not reach his eyes. "We do our best," he said, "but Carver's got the wind at his back these days." There was a pause, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand tightened around his glass, much as Mr. Hodge, the village butcher, had gripped his cleaver when speaking of a rival who undercut his prices. The final guest was Clara Wentworth, a young woman whose bright smile and rapid chatter marked her as an outsider striving to belong. Her dress, a shade too vivid for the occasion, and her nervous habit of twisting a pearl necklace suggested anxiety beneath her vivacity. "Oh, Miss Marple," Clara said, approaching with a glass of white wine, "I've heard you're quite the sleuth. How thrilling to meet you." Her enthusiasm was earnest, but Miss Marple sensed a tremor in her voice, as if she were reciting lines from a play. "Hardly a sleuth," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle. "I'm merely an old woman who notices things." Clara laughed, a little too loudly, and Miss Marple observed the way her eyes darted toward the other guests, as if seeking approval. It reminded her of young Lucy Islesborough, who had once come to St. Mary Mead with a secret she was too frightened to share. Dinner was announced, and the guests moved to the dining room, a long chamber with a table set with silver and crystal that gleamed under a chandelier. The meal was exquisite roast pheasant, creamed potatoes, and a delicate asparagus soup butt. Miss Marple paid more attention to the conversation than the food. Carver dominated, his voice rising as he spoke of his new vintage, Vin Royale, which he claimed would elevate Chateau Vin to new heights. "It's a blend unlike any other," he said, his eyes alight with pride. "Tomorrow's tasting will be a revelation." Marcel nodded approvingly, though his expression was unreadable. Evelyn, seated across from Carver, stared at her plate, her fork pausing mid-air. Langston raised his glass in a toast, but his smile was tight, and Miss Marple noted the brief glance he exchanged with a waiter, a young man who moved with the silent efficiency of a shadow. Clara, meanwhile, chattered about the history of winemaking, her facts slightly muddled, as if she had memorized them from a book. As the meal progressed, Miss Marple observed small details, Marcel's habit of sniffing his wine before sipping, as if testing for flaws, Evelyn's subtle flinch when Carver mentioned the vineyard's recent success, Langston's overly hearty compliments, which seemed to mask a deeper resentment, and Clara's tendency to fall silent whenever the conversation turned to the vineyard's finances. These were the threads of a tapestry, Miss Marple thought, much like the village gossip that had once revealed a theft at the vicarage. Each gesture, each glance, was a clue to a larger pattern, though the design was not yet clear. After dinner, the guests retired to the drawing room for coffee. Miss Marple, declining a second cup, excused herself to step onto the terrace, where the cool night air carried the scent of earth and grapes. The vineyards stretched into the darkness, their orderly rows a contrast to the tangled motives she sensed within the house. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once remarked that country estates were like villages, only with grander facades. Here, at Chateau Vin, the facade was indeed grand, but the undercurrents were as familiar as those in St. Mary Mead. Returning to the drawing room, she found the guests dispersing to their rooms. Beatrice caught her arm. "Jane, isn't it marvelous?" she said, her eyes bright with wine and excitement. "Roland's vision for this place is extraordinary." Miss Marple smiled. "Quite," she said, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had seen the way Carver watched his guests, as if anticipating a challenge. The way Marcel's fingers lingered on the stem of his glass, as if guarding a secret. The way Evelyn's elegance masked a quiet fury. The way Langston's joviality rang hollow. And the way Clara's brightness seemed a shield. Each was a character in a drama, and Miss Marple knew that dramas, like village scandals, often ended in unexpected ways. As she climbed the staircase to her room, her footsteps soft on the thick carpet, Miss Marple felt a familiar prickle of anticipation. The weekend, she suspected, would reveal more than the quality of Chateau Vin's wine. It would uncover the truth of its people, and truth, as she had learned in St. Mary Mead, was often a bitter vintage. Chapter 3. The tasting begins. The morning sun cast a golden sheen over the vineyards of Chateau Vin, its rays filtering through the tall windows of the manor's grand cellar, where the much-anticipated wine tasting was to take place. Miss Jane Marple descended the stone steps with care, her sensible shoes tapping softly against the cool flagstones. The cellar was a cavernous space, its arched ceiling supported by ancient beams, and the air held a damp, earthy scent mingled with the faint sweetness of oak barrels lining the walls. Long tables, draped in crisp white linen, stood at the center, each adorned with rows of crystal glasses that caught the light like prisms. Bottles of Vin Royal, their labels gleaming with gold lettering, were arranged with military precision, a testament to the meticulous hand of Marcel Dubois, the SOMMELIER. Miss Marple, dressed in a neat gray frock and her usual knitted shawl, took her place among the guests, her mild eyes scanning the room. The atmosphere was one of restrained excitement, yet she sensed a tension, like the taut string of a violin before a performance. It reminded her of the annual flower show in St. Mary Mead, where smiles and compliments masked fierce rivalries over prize roses. Here, the stakes were higher, and the players more guarded. Roland Carver stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding as he raised a glass to the assembled company. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice resonant in the stone-walled chamber. "Today, we unveil Vin Royal, a wine that will place Chateau Vin among the finest in the land." His green eyes sparkled with ambition, and Miss Marple noted the way his gaze lingered on each guest, as if measuring their reactions. She recalled Mr. Thompson, the village chemist, who had once boasted of a new tonic with similar fervor, only to be undone by a miscalculation in its formula. Marcel Dubois stepped forward, his lean frame almost gliding as he began his discourse. "Vin Royal," he intoned, his French accent lending an air of authority, "is a symphony of flavors: blackberry, cassis, a hint of spice, with a velvet finish." He poured the first glass with a flourish, the deep ruby liquid catching the light. Carver, beaming, took the first sip, his expression one of triumphant satisfaction. The other guests followed, their murmurs of approval filling the air. Miss Marple, cautious as always, took a small sip, finding the wine pleasant but unremarkable to her untrained palate. Her interest lay not in the wine, but in the people around her. Evelyn St. Clair stood to Carver's left, her posture rigid, her green dress a stark contrast to the pale linen tablecloth. She held her glass delicately, but her eyes were fixed on Carver, and Miss Marple detected a flicker of something resentment, perhaps, or sorrow. It was not unlike the look Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, had given a rival who had taken over the church bazaar. Evelyn's history with the vineyard, Miss Marple knew, was a wound still raw, and such wounds could fester into dangerous motives. Victor Langston, the rival vintner, was all bluff heartiness, swirling his glass with exaggerated gusto, a fine drop, "Carver," he called, his voice booming, but Miss Marple noted the tightness of his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed as he watched Carver savor the applause. She thought of Mr. Hodge, the St. Mary Mead butcher, whose jovial manner had hidden a grudge against a competitor who threatened his trade. Langston's vineyard, Langston Vale, had suffered in Chateau Vin's shadow, and Miss Marple wondered if his cheer was a mask for envy. Clara Wentworth, the nervous young journalist, clutched her glass as if it were an anchor, her pearl necklace twisting in her fingers. Her chatter was incessant, filled with half-accurate facts about winemaking that she seemed to have gleaned from a hurried study. "Isn't it fascinating how the soil affects the grape?" she said to no one in particular, her voice high and strained. Miss Marple, watching her, was reminded of young Miss Pollitt, who had once babbled nervously at a village tea to distract from her pilfering of scones. Clara's anxiety, Miss Marple suspected, stemmed from more than social unease. As the tasting progressed, Marcel poured a second vintage, his descriptions growing more poetic. Carver, ever the showman, raised his glass again, his cheeks flushed with pride. "To Chateau Vin," he declared, and the guests echoed the toast. Miss Marple, however, was distracted by a small movement. Langston, leaning close to a young waiter, whispered something, his hand brushing the man's sleeve. The waiter, a pale youth with quick eyes, nodded and moved toward the table, adjusting the glasses with a practiced hand. Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to a St. Mary Mead incident where a whispered exchange at a fete had led to a tampered cake. Suddenly, a sharp cough broke the convivial mood. Carver, mid-sip, faltered, his hand clutching his throat. His face, moments ago radiant, turned ashen, and his glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the stone floor. The room froze, the sound of breaking crystal echoing like a gunshot. Carver staggered, his eyes wide with panic, and collapsed, his body crumpling against the table. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Evelyn stepped back, her face pale but composed. Langston's booming voice fell silent, his expression unreadable. Marcel, with surprising calm, knelt beside Carver, calling for a doctor, but Miss Marple, watching the scene unfold, knew it was too late. The man's labored breathing had ceased, and an unnatural stillness settled over him. Chaos erupted. Beatrice Harrow, who had been hovering near the cellar's entrance, rushed forward, her voice shrill with alarm. "Roland, oh heavens, what's happened?" Guests murmured, some stepping back, others crowding closer. Marcel, rising from Carver's side, barked orders to a servant to fetch the local doctor. Miss Marple, standing quietly, observed the faces around her, Evelyn's tightly controlled expression, Langston's sudden stillness, Clara's trembling hands, and Marcel's swift efficiency, which seemed almost rehearsed. Within the hour, Inspector Harrow, Beatrice's nephew, arrived with a small retinue of constables. A wiry man with a sharp nose and a nonsense air, he took charge with the briskness of one accustomed to sudden tragedies. "Nobody leaves this cellar," he declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is now a crime scene." He knelt beside Carver's body, his brow furrowing as he noted the spilled wine and shattered glass. Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively near a barrel, watched as he instructed a constable to collect the fragments. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a poisoned jam tart had required similar care, and she suspected the wine or the glass held the key to this tragedy, as the guests were herded to a corner of the cellar. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly. The suddenness of Carver's collapse suggested poison, a method both precise and personal. She thought of the village chemist's wife, who had once laced a rival's tea with a subtle toxin to settle a score. Here, the poison could have been in the bottle, but Marcel's careful oversight made that unlikely. The glass. Then she glanced at the waiter, who stood nervously by the wall, his eyes darting to Langston. There was a connection there, she was certain, but its nature remained elusive. Inspector Harrow approached her, his expression softening slightly. "Aunt Beatrice says you've a knack for these things, Miss Marple," he said, his tone respectful but tinged with skepticism. "Any thoughts?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Only that death at a tasting is most inconvenient," she said, her voice mild. "But I wonder, Inspector, if you might test Mr. Carver's glass separately from the bottle." Harrow's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. "Already planned," he said, and Miss Marple smiled, knowing he would find her suggestion sound. As the constables began their work, Miss Marple settled onto a bench, her hands folded in her lap. The cellar, once a stage for celebration, now felt like a theater of suspicion. Each guest, she knew, held a piece of the puzzle, and she would watch them closely, as she had watched the villagers of St. Mary Mead when secrets bubbled to the surface. The tasting had begun with wine, but it would end, she suspected, with truth of vintage, far more revealing. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Poison. The cellar of Chateau Vin, so recently alive with the clink of glasses and the murmur of appreciation, now lay under a pall of suspicion. The stone walls seemed to absorb the tension, their damp chill a stark contrast to the warmth of the tasting just hours before. Miss Jane Marple sat on a cushioned bench near the cellar's entrance, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap, a habit that steadied her thoughts. The constables moved with quiet efficiency, their boots scuffing the flagstones as they gathered evidence under Inspector Harrow's watchful eye. Roland Carver's body had been discreetly covered with a cloth, but the shattered glass beside him gleamed accusingly in the lantern light. Miss Marple's gaze drifted over the assembled guests, who stood in a loose cluster, their faces etched with varying shades of shock, fear, and calculation. Evelyn St. Clair, her elegant frame rigid, stared at the covered form of Carver with an expression that mingled grief with something harder to define and guard, perhaps, or resignation. Victor Langston, his robust figure slouched against a barrel, muttered to himself, his earlier joviality replaced by a grim set to his jaw. Clara Wentworth, her hands twisting her pearl necklace until Miss Marple feared it might snap, darted nervous glances at the others, her lips moving as if rehearsing a defense. Marcel Dubois, the sommelier, stood apart, his arms crossed, his face a mask of professional detachment. Though his fingers tapped restlessly against his sleeve, Inspector Harrow, his sharp features taut with focus, addressed the group. "The coroner's preliminary findings suggest poison," he said, his voice clipped. "Likely administered through the wine or the glass Mr. Carver used. Until we know more, no one leaves the estate." A murmur rippled through the guests, but none protested. Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the way Evelyn's eyes flickered to the table, where the remaining glasses stood untouched. It was a look she had seen before, on Mrs. Elkins of St. Mary Mead, when a poisoned scone had been traced to her kitchen. Harrow began his questioning. Starting with Marcel, the sommelier's responses were precise, almost mechanical. "The bottles were sealed when I inspected them this morning," he said, his French accent lending a clipped authority. "I opened each one myself, and the glasses were clean, handled only by the staff under my supervision." Harrow pressed him, asking if anyone could have tampered with the wine beforehand. Marcel's mustache twitched. "Impossible," he said. "The cellar is locked, and I hold the only key." Miss Marple, knitting steadily, thought of Mr. Pye, the village baker, who had sworn his storeroom was secure, only for a rival to reveal a hidden entrance. She wondered if Chateau Vin's cellar held similar secrets. Evelyn St. Clair was next, her voice low and steady, despite the strain in her eyes. "I had no reason to harm Roland," she said, her hands clasped tightly. "Yes, I resented losing the vineyard, but I stayed on to protect its legacy." Harrow asked about her movements during the tasting. "I was at the table, like everyone else," she replied. "I touched nothing but my own glass." Miss Marple noted the faint tremble in her voice, not unlike that of Mrs. Clement, whose calm facade had cracked when questioned about a stolen heirloom. Evelyn's attachment to Chateau Vin, Miss Marple suspected, might run deeper than mere sentiment. Victor Langston's interrogation was more contentious. "I'm a competitor, not a murderer," he blustered, his ruddy cheeks flushing deeper. "Carver and I had our differences, but poison, that's not my style." Harrow inquired about his whispered exchange with the waiter, Tom, during the tasting. Langston's eyes narrowed. "Just asking for more wine," he said gruffly. "Nothing sinister." Miss Marple, recalling a St. Mary Mead grocer who had paid a boy to sabotage a rival's delivery, wondered if Langston's denial was as hollow as it sounded. Clara Wentworth's interview was marked by her nervous chatter. "I barely knew Mr. Carver," she said, her words tumbling over each other. "I'm just here to learn about wine. I didn't see anything unusual, I swear." Her hands fluttered to her necklace, and Miss Marple, watching, was reminded of young Miss Pollitt, whose nervous tics had betrayed her guilt and a petty theft. Clara's anxiety, however, seemed rooted in fear rather than culpability. What, Miss Marple wondered, was she so afraid of? As the questioning concluded, Inspector Harrow approached Miss Marple, his notebook in hand. "Aunt Beatrice swears you see things others miss," he said, his tone a mix of respect and curiosity. "What's your take on this, Miss Marple?" Needles paused, and she looked up, her eyes bright with quiet intelligence. "Poison is a personal weapon, Inspector," she said softly. "It requires opportunity and intent. I suspect the poison was in Mr. Carver's glass, not the bottle, for no one else fell ill. Someone acted swiftly during the tasting itself." Harrow nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We're testing the glass now," he said. "Anything else?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only that people are rarely what they seem," she said, resuming her knitting. "In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a woman who poisoned a rival's tea over a garden dispute. Motives, Inspector, are often smaller than we expect." Harrow moved off to confer with his constables, and Miss Marple. Thoughts turned to the dynamics of the group. Marcel's pride in his craft made him a candidate for tampering, yet his openness about the cellar's security suggested confidence rather than deceit. Evelyn's bitterness was palpable, but her love for the vineyard seemed to outweigh her resentment. Langston's rivalry with Carver was a clear motive, and his interaction with the waiter hinted at a plan. Clara's nervousness, meanwhile, suggested she knew more than she admitted, perhaps something unrelated to the crime itself. As the guests were escorted to the drawing room to await further instructions, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes drawn to the table where Carver's glass had shattered. A constable was carefully collecting the fragments, and she noted a faint residue on one piece, a powdery film, invisible to a casual glance. It reminded her of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a poisoned cordial had left a similar trace, overlooked, until she pointed it out to the local sergeant. She made a mental note to mention this to Harrow, but for now, she kept her counsel. Knowing that observation was her greatest tool, the cellar grew quiet, the constable's work nearly done. Miss Marple rose, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, and made her way upstairs. The shadow of poison hung over Chateau Vin, and she knew that uncovering its source would require peeling back layers of pretense. Each suspect, like a character in a village drama, had their secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel them, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 5. The Sommelier's Secret. The drawing room of Chateau Vin, with its heavy velvet curtains and flickering firelight, felt stifling despite the autumn chill seeping through the windows. Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner armchair, her knitting needles moving with their usual rhythmic calm, though her eyes were anything but idle. The guests, confined to the manor while Inspector Harrow's investigation unfolded, had dispersed into small knots of conversation, their voices low and strained. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and Miss Marple, accustomed to the undercurrents of village gatherings, sensed that each glance and murmur held a clue to the tragedy in the cellar. Her attention settled on Marcel Dubois, the sommelier, who stood near a sideboard, polishing a wine glass with a white cloth. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, and Miss Marple noted the way his dark eyes scanned the room, as if assessing the mood of a vintage before serving it. Marcel's expertise made him a natural suspect in a poisoning tied to wine, yet his demeanor, cool, controlled, almost aloof, suggested a man confident in his innocence. Or, Miss Marple thought, recalling Mr. Ellis, the St. Mary Mead tailor, who had hidden a theft behind a mask of professionalism, perhaps too confident. She rose, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, and approached Marcel, her manner as unassuming as a village spinster inquiring about a recipe. "Monsieur Dubois," she said, her voice gentle, "your knowledge of wine is quite remarkable. I confess I know little beyond what's served at the vicarage, but your descriptions yesterday were positively poetic." Marcel's thin mustache twitched, and he inclined his head, a faint smile softening his features. "You flatter me, Mademoiselle Marple," he said. "Wine is an art, and I am merely its servant." His accent lent a musical quality to his words, but Miss Marple detected a guarded note, like a door left slightly ajar. "I imagine it must be trying," she continued, settling onto a nearby chair, "to see your expertise overshadowed by Mr. Carver's enthusiasm." Marcel's smile faded, and his fingers tightened briefly on the glass. "Mr. Carver was a businessman," he said carefully. "He understood profit, not palate. Chateau Vin was faltering before I arrived. My blends, my methods, revived it. Yet, he took the credit." The bitterness in his tone was subtle, but to Miss Marple, it was as clear as the Thames of a spoiled apple in Mrs. Baker's prize jam. Here was a motive, she thought, though whether it led to murder remained uncertain. She probed further, her tone light. "Such a responsibility, overseeing the cellar, the bottles, the glasses, all under your care. It must require immense trust." Marcel's eyes met hers, sharp and searching. "Indeed," he said, "I am meticulous. No one touches the wine without my knowledge." His words were firm, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease, a slight shift in his posture. She recalled a St. Mary Mead grocer who had sworn his scales were honest, only for a careful inspection to reveal tampering. And yet, she said, almost to herself, something slipped through. Before Marcel could respond, a commotion at the door drew their attention. Inspector Harrow entered, his sharp features set in a frown. "Monsieur Dubois," he said. "A word." Marcel excused himself, and Miss Marple watched as he followed Harrow to a corner of the room. Their voices were low, but she caught fragments. Missing bottle, Vin Royale, cellar records. Her interest sharpened. Earlier, she had overheard Marcel arguing with a cellar worker about a missing bottle, his tone edged with frustration. "It was here yesterday," he had snapped. Now, as she observed his tense posture, she wondered if that bottle held the key to the poison's delivery. Returning to her seat, Miss Marple let her knitting resume, her mind sifting through possibilities. Marcel's pride in his craft was evident, but pride could curdle into resentment when unacknowledged. Had Carver's habit of claiming credit driven Marcel to a desperate act? Yet, his openness about his role in the Vineyard's success seemed at odds with the secrecy required for murder. She thought of Miss Blacklock, a St. Mary Mead spinster, who had once orchestrated a deception with such candor that no one suspected her until the final moment. Marcel, she decided, warranted closer scrutiny. The afternoon wore on, and the guests were permitted a brief walk in the gardens, under the watchful eye of a constable. Miss Marple joined them, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes taking in the manicured hedges and the distant rows of vines. Marcel walked alone, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She approached him again, this time with a question about the cellar's security. "It must be quite a task," keeping such a place locked?" she said, her tone conversational. Marcel nodded. "The cellar has one entrance, one key," he said. "I carry it always." He patted his waistcoat, where the silver corkscrew hung. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a slight hesitation, as if he were reassuring himself, as they returned to the manor. Miss Marple lingered near the cellar door, now guarded by a constable. She recalled the missing bottle and Marcel's insistence that the cellar was secure. In St. Mary Mead, a locked pantry had once been breached by a duplicate key, a fact uncovered only when a maid's nervous glance betrayed her. Did Marcel's confidence mask a similar oversight? Or was he protecting someone or something else? Back in the drawing room, she overheard a snippet of conversation between two servants, who spoke in hushed tones about Marcel's late-night visits to the cellar. "Always checking the barrels," one said. "But last week, he was there past midnight." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to the possibility that Marcel's vigilance was not entirely professional. Had he discovered something in the cellar, a flaw in the wine, or perhaps a deliberate sabotage that he kept hidden? She resolved to share her thoughts with Inspector Harrow, but only when she had more to offer than supposition. As evening fell, the guests gathered for a subdued dinner, the absence of Carver's commanding presence casting a shadow over the table. Marcel, serving the wine with his usual precision, avoided Miss Marple's gaze, and she noted the way his hand lingered on each glass, as if ensuring its safety or concealing a trace of guilt. The sommelier's secret, she sensed, was not yet fully revealed, but like a fine wine left to breathe, it would soon disclose its true character. Chapter 6. The former owners grudged the morning light filtered through the heavy drapes of Chateau Vin's library, where Miss Jane Marple had settled with a cup of tea, her knitting resting momentarily in her lap. The room, lined with leather-bound books and smelling faintly of old paper and polished wood, offered a quiet retreat from the tension that clung to the manor like mist over the vineyards. The events of the previous Darrell and Carver's sudden death and the shadow of poison had left the guests subdued, their polite exchanges laced with unease. Miss Marple, however, found the library's calm conducive to thought, much as her parlor in St. Mary Mead had often served as a backdrop for unraveling village intrigues. Her attention today was drawn to Evelyn St. Clair, the former owner of Chateau Vin, whose poised elegance seemed at odds with the bitterness Miss Marple had glimpsed in her eyes. Evelyn's connection to the vineyard ran deep, like roots in fertile soil, and Miss Marple suspected that her loss of the estate to Carver was a wound that had not healed. It reminded her of Mrs. Dane Calthrop in St. Mary Mead, whose serene demeanor had masked a fierce resentment when her family's cottage was sold to a newcomer. Such grudges, Miss Marple knew, could simmer into dangerous acts. She found Evelyn on the terrace, gazing out at the vineyards, her silver hair catching the sunlight. Clad in a tailored coat of deep blue, Evelyn held a cigarette, its smoke curling lazily upward. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft on the stone path. "Good morning, Mrs. St. Clair," she said, her voice gentle as a village gossip sharing a confidence. "The vines are lovely in this light, aren't they? Almost as if they carry the history of this place." Evelyn turned, her expression softening but guarded. "They do," she said, her voice low. "Every row, every grape, it was my life's work." The words held a quiet intensity, and Miss Marple noted the way Evelyn's fingers tightened around the cigarette, a gesture not unlike Mrs. Harmon's when speaking of a rival who had usurped her role in the church choir. They sat on a bench, and Miss Marple, with the tact of one accustomed to drawing out secrets, steered the conversation to the vineyard's past. "It must have been difficult," she said, "to see Chateau Vin change hands." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "Difficult is a mild word," she said. "Carver bought it when I was at my lowest debts, bad harvests, a husband who left me to face it alone. He offered a pittance, and I had no choice." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple caught the tremor of old anger. like the faint crack in a teacup that betrays its fragility. And yet you stayed on? Miss Marple prompted, her eyes kind but probing. Evelyn nodded. As a consultant, I couldn't abandon the vines. They're more than property, they're a legacy. The word legacy hung in the air, and Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead widow who had poisoned a rival's roses to preserve her garden's reputation. Could Evelyn's devotion to Chateau Vin have driven her to a similar extreme? Mr. Carver's success must have been a mixed blessing, Miss Marple said, her tone light. His new vintage Vin Royale seemed to mean so much to him. Evelyn's eyes darkened. He cared for profit, not the vines, she said. Vin Royale was Marcel's creation, but Carver claimed it as his own. He had no respect for what this place was. The bitterness was unmistakable now, and Miss Marple noted the way Evelyn's hand crushed the cigarette, scattering ash on the bench. As they spoke, a faint chemical odor reached Miss Marple's nose, not from the cigarette, but from Evelyn's coat. It was subtle, like the whiff of polish in a chemist's shop, and it stirred a memory of a St. Mary Mead case, where a poisoned cordial had left a similar trace on a shawl. She made no comment, but her mind catalogued the detail, wondering if Evelyn's access to the cellar as a consultant had provided opportunity as well as motive. Their conversation was interrupted by Inspector Harrow, who emerged onto the terrace, his notebook in hand. "Mrs. St. Clair," he said, his tone formal, "I'd like to review your movements during the tasting again." Evelyn rose, her composure intact, but Miss Marple noticed a fleeting tension in her posture, like a cat bracing for a leap. As Evelyn followed Harrow inside, Miss Marple remained on the bench, her thoughts turning to the cellar. Evelyn's role as consultant gave her intimate knowledge of its workings, perhaps even access to its secrets. Had she tampered with Carver's glass, driven by a desire to reclaim her legacy, or to destroy the man who had taken it? Later, Miss Marple joined Beatrice Harrow for tea in the drawing room, using the opportunity to inquire about Evelyn's history. Beatrice, ever eager to share gossip, leaned forward. "Oh, Jane, it was such a scandal when Evelyn lost the vineyard. Her husband's debts, you know, gambling mostly. She fought to keep it, but Carver swooped in like a hawk. She's never forgiven him, though she hides it well." Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. "And yet she stayed," she mused. Beatrice's eyes widened. "Pride, I suppose, or stubbornness. She couldn't bear to leave the vines she'd nurtured for years." The words confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Evelyn's attachment was not merely sentimental, but fiercely possessive. That afternoon, Miss Marple slipped away to the library, where she found a ledger of the vineyard's accounts, left open. On a table, the figures told a story of struggle before Carver's purchase, followed by a sharp upturn in profits thanks, no doubt, to Marcel's expertise and Carver's business acumen. Evelyn's name appeared as a consultant, her salary modest but steady. Miss Marple wondered if the sight of those profits, reaped by another, had fueled her resentment. She recalled a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who had sabotaged a rival's goods out of envy for their success. Was Evelyn capable of such an act, cloaked in her elegant restraint? As evening approached, Miss Marple joined the guests for another tense dinner, where Evelyn's composure was impeccable, though her eyes rarely met those of the others. Marcel served the wine with his usual precision, Langston's forced joviality grated, and Clara's nervous chatter filled the silences. Miss Marple, watching Evelyn, noted the way she handled her glass carefully, as if aware of its potential as a weapon. The chemical odor lingered in her memory, and she resolved to mention it to Inspector Harrow, though she would frame it as a casual observation, as she had done with the sergeant in St. Mary Mead, when a poisoned cake had nearly escaped notice. The former owner's grudge, Miss Marple knew, was a potent force, like a vine that thrives in adversity. Whether it had blossomed into murder remained to be seen, but she was certain that Evelyn St. Clair, like the vineyards she loved, held secrets. that would yield only to patient scrutiny. Chapter 7. The Rival's Ambition. The late afternoon sun bathed Chateau Vin in a warm amber glow, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and the orderly rows of vines that stretched toward the horizon. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a wicker chair in the Manor's conservatory, gazed out through the glass panes, her knitting needles idle for once, as her mind sifted through the threads of suspicion that had woven themselves around the guests. The conservatory, with its potted ferns and faint scent of damp earth, was a tranquil contrast to the mounting tension within the house, where Roland Carver's death hung like a storm cloud. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Victor Langston, the rival vintner, whose hearty demeanor seemed increasingly at odds with the sharp glances he cast when he thought no one was watching. His ambition, she suspected, was a fire that burned hotter than his jovial facade suggested. Much like Mr. Hodge, the St. Mary mead butcher, whose bluff friendliness had masked a scheme to undermine a competitor, Victor Langston was a man built for the outdoors, his broad shoulders and weathered hands speaking of years spent tending vines rather than ledgers. Yet his tailored suit and polished cufflinks betrayed a hunger for success that went beyond mere craftsmanship. Miss Marple had observed him closely during the tasting, noting his forced enthusiasm as he toasted Carver's Vin Royale, and the whispered exchange with the waiter, Tom, which had struck her as more than a casual request. Now, as she watched him pace the lawn, his cigar trailing smoke like a signal, she resolved to learn more about the man whose vineyard, Langston Vale, had faltered in Chateau Vin's ascendant shadow. She found her opportunity after lunch, when the guests were permitted a brief stroll under the watchful eye of a constable. Langston stood near a stone fountain, its gentle trickle a soothing counterpoint to the unease that clung to the group. Miss Marple approached, her step slow and her smile disarming, as if she were merely an elderly lady seeking conversation. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice soft, "this is such a splendid place. I understand your own vineyard is not far from here. It must be quite a rivalry, with Chateau Vin so celebrated now." Langston turned, his ruddy face breaking into a grin that did not quite reach his eyes. "Oh, we manage at Langston Vale," he said, puffing on his cigar. But Carver had a knack for stealing the spotlight. "I'll show you no less substance than he'd have you believe." The words were light, but Miss Marple caught the edge in his tone, like the bite of a knife hidden in a velvet sheath. She tilted her head, her eyes bright with feigned innocence. "It must be challenging," she said, "to compete with such a dynamic figure." His Vin Royale seemed to excite everyone. Langston's smile tightened, and he flicked ash into the fountain. "Vin Royale," he muttered. "Marcel's work, not Carver's." The man was a vulture, picking over others' talents. "Langston Vale's been in my family for generations. Proper wine, proper methods. Carver's flash won't last." The bitterness was raw now, and Miss Marple thought of Mr. Grayson, the St. Mary mead solicitor, whose cheerful facade had crumbled when a rival's success threatened his own. Langston's ambition, she sensed, was not just to compete, but to dominate. And Carver's triumph had been a personal affront. Their conversation was interrupted by Beatrice Harrow, who bustled over with her usual effervescence. "Victor, you must tell Jane about your lovely vineyard," she exclaimed, oblivious to the tension. Langston's grin returned, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand clenched a cigar, nearly crushing it. "Another time, perhaps," he said, excusing himself to join Clara Wentworth, who hovered nervously nearby. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind turning to the tasting, where Langston had lingered near Carver's glass. His toast a performance that seemed rehearsed. Had he orchestrated more than a gesture of goodwill? Later, in the drawing room, Ms. Marple sought out Beatrice for more insight into Langston's rivalry. Over tea, Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the delight of sharing a tidbit. "Oh, Jane, Victor's been positively green with envy since Carver took over Chateau Vin. Langston Vale used to be the toast of Sussex. But Carver's marketing those flashy ads, those society tastings stole all the attention. Victor's sales have plummeted, and I hear he's taken loans to keep up. Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. Debt and envy, she knew from a St. Mary Mead case involving a grocer's sabotage, were a potent mix. Langston's ambition to reclaim his vineyard's glory could well have driven him to a desperate act. Her thoughts were interrupted by Inspector Harrow, who entered with a grim expression. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, drawing her aside, "the tests confirm poison. In Carver's glass something fast-acting, likely slipped in during the tasting. The bottle itself was clean." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "As I suspected," she said. "The poisoner needed only a moment. Then, Mr. Langston, I recall, was quite near the table during the toast." Harrow's eyebrows rose. "You noticed that too?" "We're looking into his movements, but he's cagey about that waiter, Tom." Miss Marple nodded, her mind returning to the whispered exchange she had witnessed. "In St. Mary Mead, she said a farmer once paid a lad to spoil a rival's hay. Small payments can buy great mischief." Harrow jotted a note, his respect for her growing. That evening, as the guests gathered for another strained dinner, Miss Marple observed Langston closely. He laughed too loudly, his stories of Langston Vale's past glories tinged with defiance. When Marcel poured the wine, Langston's eyes followed the glass, as if wary of its contents or, perhaps recalling his own handiwork. Miss Marple noted the way he avoided looking at Tom, who moved silently among the tables, his face pale and his hands unsteady. The waiter, she suspected, was a link in Langston's chain, much as a village boy had been in a St. Mary Mead plot to ruin a rival's crop. As the meal ended, Miss Marple slipped away to the library, where she found a trade journal left open. On a table, an article detailed the rivalry between Chateau Vin and Langston Vale, noting Carver's aggressive expansion and Langston's struggle to compete. A underlined passage caught her eye. "Langston Vale faces foreclosure unless sales recover." The ink was fresh, and Miss Marple wondered if Langston himself had read it, his ambition curdling into desperation. She recalled a St. Mary Mead merchant who had burned a rival's shop to stave off ruin. Was Langston's act, if he was guilty, born of a similar need to reclaim his place? Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting resumed. Langston's ambition, she knew, was a fire that could consume more than his rival's reputation. Whether it had led to poison remained to be proven, but she was certain that his hardy exterior hid a motive as potent as any vintage in Chateau Vin's cellar. Chapter 8. The guests' nervousness. The morning mist clung to the vineyards of Chateau Vin, softening the outlines of the vines and lending an air of quiet mystery to the estate. Inside the manor, the atmosphere was less serene, the guests' faces marked by the strain of confinement and suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with a view of the Duchest Gardens, sipped her tea and observed the others with her usual unobtrusive attention. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, a prop that allowed her to blend into the background while her sharp eyes missed nothing. The focus of her thoughts today was Clara Wentworth, the young journalist whose nervous chatter and restless hands had intrigued her from the start. Clara's behavior, so like that of young Miss Pollitt in St. Mary Mead, who had fidgeted her way through a village tea while hiding a pilfered brooch, suggested a secret perhaps not of guilt, but of knowledge too. Heavy to bear. Clara sat by the window, her bright dress a splash of color against the muted tones of the room. She clutched a small notebook, her fingers twisting the pencil as if it were her pearl necklace, which she had abandoned after nearly breaking it the previous day. Her eyes darted from guest to guest, lingering longest on Victor Langston, who was engrossed in a newspaper, and Evelyn St. Clair, who gazed out at the vineyards with a distant expression. Miss Marple noted the way Clara's lips moved silently, as if rehearsing a speech, and recalled a St. Mary Mead girl who had muttered to herself before confessing to a minor theft. Clara, she suspected, was wrestling with something she dared not voice. Seizing an opportunity, Miss Marple rose and joined Clara by the window, her manner as gentle as a village aunt, offering comfort. "Miss Wentworth," she said, her voice soft, "you seem quite taken with the view. The vineyards are lovely, aren't they? Almost like a painting." Clara started, her pencil slipping to the floor. "Oh, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, her smile too bright. "Yes, they're beautiful. I was just thinking about an article I'm writing, about wine, you know." Her words tumbled out, and Miss Marple noted the flush creeping up her neck, a telltale sign of unease she had seen in many a St. Mary Mead parishioner caught in a fib. "An article sounds fascinating," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair beside her. "You must have a keen interest in Chateau Vin to come all this way, though I imagine it's more than just the wine that draws you." Her tone was kind, but her eyes were sharp, inviting confidence without pressing. Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening on the notebook. "Well, I'm a journalist," she said, as if confessing a fault. "I was invited to cover the tasting, but I thought, well, there might be a bigger story here." Her voice dropped to a whisper, and she glanced nervously at the other guests. Miss Marple leaned closer, her expression one of mild curiosity. "A bigger story," she prompted. "How intriguing." Clara bit her lip, then spoke in a rush. "Mr. Carver had enemies. I heard rumors, business dealings, shady ones. I was supposed to meet him after the tasting to ask about, well, things I'd heard." But then her voice trailed off, and her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to a St. Mary Mead shopgirl who had stumbled onto a scandal and trembled at the thought of revealing it. "You must have been quite shocked by what happened," she said gently. "Did you notice anything during the tasting? Something out of place, perhaps?" Clara shook her head, her curls bouncing. "No, nothing. I was too nervous, trying to fit in. I don't know wine like the others. I saw Mr. Langston talking to the waiter. That's all." Her words were quick, almost defensive, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided meeting hers. The conversation was interrupted by Beatrice Harrow, who swept in with a tray of scones, her cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the room's tension. "Jane, Clara, you must try these," she exclaimed, oblivious to the undercurrents. Clara seized the distraction, murmuring an excuse and slipping away to the garden. Miss Marple, watching her go, thought of the notebook Clara clutched so tightly. It was not unlike the diary of a St. Mary Mead schoolteacher, which had contained cryptic notes that led to a blackmail scheme. What, she wondered, did Clara's notebook hold? Later, as the guests were permitted a supervised walk in the gardens, Miss Marple found herself near Clara again, who was lingering by a rosebush, her notebook open as she scribbled furiously. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft on the gravel path. "You're quite dedicated to your work," she said, nodding at the notebook. Clara flushed, snapping it shut. "Just notes," she said quickly. "Ideas for my article." But Miss Marple's keen eyes caught a glimpse of a phrase before the cover closed. "Vin Royale Sabotage." The word sent a ripple through her thoughts, reminding her of a St. Mary Mead rumor about tainted preserves that had nearly ruined a village fete. Was Clara onto something, or was she merely speculating? Seeking to confirm her suspicions, Miss Marple joined Inspector Harrow in the library, where he was reviewing statements. "Miss Wentworth seems quite anxious," she said, her tone casual. "She mentioned hearing rumors about Mr. Carver's business dealings. Perhaps she knows more than she's saying." Harrow's sharp eyes met hers. "She's been cagey," he admitted. "Claims she's just a journalist, but her story's thin. We're checking her background." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Clara's nervous mention of Langston and the waiter. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "a young girl once overheard a plot and was too frightened to speak. Miss Wentworth may be in a similar bind. Harrow jotted a note, his respect for her insights evident. That evening, during another tense dinner, Miss Marple watched Clara closely. The young woman's chatter was relentless, filled with trivial facts about winemaking that seemed gleaned from a hurried reading. Yet her eyes kept straying to Langston, who sat with a forced smile, and to the waiter, Tom, whose pale face betrayed his own unease. When Marcel poured the wine, Clara's hand shook as she reached for her glass, and Miss Marple wondered if she feared the contents or the consequences of what she knew. As the meal ended, Miss Marple slipped into the hallway, where she caught sight of Clara hurrying toward her room. A moment later, she heard a faint rustle and saw Clara drop something, a scrap of paper from her notebook. Retrieving it discreetly, Miss Marple found a scrawled note, Langston cellar access. Check. Records. It was a clue, small but significant, like the torn letter that had unraveled the St. Mary Mead mystery involving a stolen will. Clara, it seemed, was piecing together a puzzle of her own, one that pointed to Langston's ambition, and perhaps his guilt. Miss Marple tucked the paper into her sleeve, resolving to watch Clara closely. The young journalist's nervousness, she sensed, was not that of a murderer, but of a witness. Caught in a web of secrets she was too frightened to unravel. Alone, like a grape on the vine, Clara's knowledge was ripening, and Miss Marple knew that with gentle coaxing, it might yield the truth. Chapter 9. The Missing Bottles à Erin Chateau. Vin's drawing room was heavy with the scent of wax polish and the faint tense of unease. As the guests sat in uneasy silence, their movements constrained by the ongoing investigation, Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in a velvet-holstered chair near a tall window, knitted with a steady rhythm, her eyes flitting over the room with the quiet alertness of a bird watching for danger. The morning's revelations had sharpened her focus, particularly on the scrap of paper she had retrieved from Clara Wentworth's notebook, with its cryptic note about Victor Langston and cellar access. Yet another detail nagged at her memory: Marcel Dubois's heated exchange with a cellar worker about a missing bottle of Vin Royal. In St. Mary Mead, a missing jar of preserves had once led to a poisoning scandal, and Miss Marple suspected that this bottle might hold the key to Roland Carver's death. The guests, under Inspector Harrow's orders, were confined to the manor's public rooms, their every move watched by a constable. Marcel stood by the fireplace, his lean frame taut as he polished a decanter with unnecessary vigor. Evelyn St. Clair sat at a writing desk, her pen scratching across a letter, though her eyes often drifted to the window, as if seeking solace in the vineyards beyond. Victor Langston, his robust figure slumped in an armchair, leafed through a newspaper with feigned interest, while Clara Wentworth, her nervous energy barely contained, scribbled in her notebook, her pencil jerking with each glance at the others. Miss Marple, observing them, felt the familiar prickle of a puzzle nearing its solution. Like the moment in St. Mary Mead, when a misplaced letter had unraveled a village feud, she approached Inspector Harrow, who was reviewing notes in a corner of the room, his sharp features creased with concentration. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I couldn't help overhearing Monsieur Dubois mention a missing bottle of Vin Royal. It seemed to trouble him greatly. Perhaps it's worth a closer look." Harrow's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "We've been through the cellar records," he said. "One bottle is unaccounted for, and Dubois claims it was there the day before the tasting. I'm organizing a search." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "a missing bottle of cordial once held a bitter secret. I suspect this one may be similar." Harrow jotted a note, his respect for her instincts growing. The search was promptly arranged, and Miss Marple, permitted to observe as a courtesy to Beatrice Harrow, followed Harrow and a constable to the cellar. The stone-walled chamber, once vibrant with the clink of glasses, now felt like a crypt, its air cool and heavy. Marcel accompanied them, his keyring jangling as he unlocked the door, his expression a mix of defiance and unease. "I checked every bottle myself," he insisted, his French accent clipped. The missing one was from the reserve stock, set aside for the tasting. It vanished overnight. Miss Marple, standing quietly by a barrel, noted the way his fingers toyed with the silver corkscrew at his waist, a gesture she had seen in nervous villagers hiding half-truths. The constable, young man with a methodical air, began inspecting the racks, his lantern casting flickering shadows across the oak barrels. Miss Marple's eyes roamed the cellar, taking in the orderly rows of bottles and the faint dust on the stone floor. She recalled a St. Mary mead case, where a hidden jar of poisoned jam had been found behind a pantry shelf, overlooked by all but the keenest observer. "Might you look behind the barrels, Inspector?" she suggested, her tone mild. "Things are often tucked away where one least expects." Harrow raised an eyebrow, but nodded to the constable, who began shifting barrels with care. After several minutes, the constable called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Here, sir." Behind a stack of older barrels, partially concealed by a loose burlap sack, was a bottle of vin royal, its seal broken and its label slightly smudged. Harrow lifted it carefully, his gloved hands ensuring no evidence was disturbed. "This is it," he said, examining the cork, which bore signs of tampering. "We'll send it for testing." Marcel's face paled, his hand stilling on the corkscrew. "I don't understand," he muttered. "It was locked away." Miss Marple, watching him, thought of a St. Mary mead baker who had sworn his storeroom was secure, only for a duplicate key to betray him. Back in the drawing room, Harrow shared the findings with the guests, his voice steady but firm. "The bottle contained traces of a rare poison," he said, "odorless and tasteless, matching what killed Mr. Carver. Someone hid it, likely to cover their tracks." The room grew still, and Miss Marple observed the reactions. Marcel's jaw tightened, Evelyn's pen froze mid-word, Langston's newspaper slipped to the floor, and Clara's pencil snapped in her hand. Each response was a thread in the tapestry, and Miss Marple's mind wove them together. Considering motives and opportunities, Marcel, with his access to the cellar, could have tampered with the bottle, but his pride in his craft argued against ruining his own creation. Evelyn's resentment gave her motive, and her role as consultant provided access. But her love for the vineyard suggested a different kind of passion. Clara's nervousness hinted at knowledge, not action, her note about Langston pointing elsewhere. Langston, however, stood out. His rivalry with Carver was fierce, and his whispered exchange with the waiter, Tom, suggested a plan. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary mead grocer who had hidden tainted goods to disgrace a competitor. Had Langston poisoned the bottle to ruin Chateau Vin's reputation, with Carver's death as a tragic bonus? She approached Harrow later, her knitting tucked under her arm. "The bottle's hiding place suggests intent," she said. "Someone meant to retrieve it later, or ensure it wasn't found. Mr. Langston's ambition to outshine Chateau Vin might have led him to such a scheme." Harrow nodded, his notebook open. "We're questioning the waiter again," he said. "He's nervous, and Langston's been avoiding him." Miss Marple smiled faintly. In St. Mary mead, a boy once hid a stolen pie for a shopkeeper. Small accomplices can reveal great truths. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed. The missing bottle had been found, but its secrets were only beginning to uncork. Langston's ambition, she sensed, was the strongest thread, but the weave of motives, Marcel's pride, Evelyn's grudge, Clara's fear still held surprises. Like a vintage left to age, the truth would reveal itself, and Miss Marple was patient enough to wait. Chapter 10. A village parallel. The evening shadows lengthened across Chateau Vin's sprawling lawns, the vineyards beyond fading into a dusky haze. Inside the manor, the library offered Miss Jane Marple a haven of quiet, its shelves of leather-bound volumes and soft lamplight a balm to the tension that gripped the household. She sat by a low fire, her knitting needles moving with their familiar cadence. though her mind was far from the intricate pattern in her hands. The discovery of the poisoned bottle of Vin Royale had sharpened the investigation, and Miss Marple thoughts circled around Victor Langston, whose ambition seemed the most potent motive for Roland Carver's death. Yet the threads of suspicion, Marcel's pride, Evelyn's grudge, Clara's nervous knowledge still required careful untangling. As she knitted, she drew parallels to a St. Mary Mead scandal, where a baker's sabotage of a rival's flour had revealed a motive rooted in envy and desperation, much like the one she suspected here. The library's heavy door creaked open, admitting Inspector Harrow, his sharp features softened by fatigue but alight with purpose. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair opposite her, "you've been a quiet presence. But Aunt Beatrice swears your insights are sharper than my constable's. The poisoned bottle's a breakthrough, but we're still missing the how and why." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up, her pale eyes bright with quiet intelligence. "The how, Inspector, is often simpler than the why," she said. "In St. Mary Mead, a baker once laced a rival's flour with a bitter herb to ruin his bread. The act was simpler moment's access to a sack, but the motive was complex. Envy, fear of ruin, a need to reclaim lost pride. I suspect Mr. Langston's actions may follow a similar pattern." Harrow leaned forward, his notebook open. "Langston's our strongest lead," he said. "The waiter," Tom admitted, "Langston paid him to swap Carver's glass with one from the tampered bottle. Claims he didn't know it was poisoned, just thought it was a prank to embarrass Carver." Miss Marple nodded, her mind flashing to a St. Mary Mead lad who had been paid to slip salt into a rival's sugar bowl, unaware of the deeper intent. "Tom's youth makes him pliable," she said. "But Langston's motivized Vineyard's decline. His envy of Carver's success suggests a plan to disgrace Chateau Vin, not necessarily to kill. Death, perhaps, was an unintended flourish." She recounted the village parallel in more detail, her voice soft but precise. "Mr. Perkins, the baker, was a proud man, much like Mr. Langston. His shop had been the pride of St. Mary Mead until a new baker arrived, drawing customers with fresher loaves and lower prices. Perkins, desperate, tampered with his rival's flour, hoping to ruin his reputation. The sabotage was discovered when a customer fell ill, not fatally, but enough to expose the plot. Perkins confessed, driven by fear of losing his livelihood. I wonder if Mr. Langston, facing foreclosure on Langstonvale, sought a similar outcome, a scandal to tarnish Vin Royale, with Carver's death an unforeseen consequence." Harrow jotted notes, his brow furrowed. "The poison was rare, though," he said. "Not something you'd use for a mere prank. Langston's got access to chemicals his vineyard uses pesticides. We're checking his stores." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "A prudent step," she said. "In St. Mary Mead, the baker's herb came from his own garden, easily overlooked. Mr. Langston's resources, I suspect, are similarly close at hand." She paused, her needles resuming their rhythm. "And the waiter, Tom's nervousness suggests he knows more than he's said. A gentle question might loosen his tongue." Harrow nodded, rising. "We're bringing Tom in again, and Langston's not leaving my sight." As he left, Miss Marple turned her attention to the other guests, who had gathered in the drawing room for a strained tea. Victor Langston sat, apart, his newspaper abandoned, his ruddy face pale as he stared into his cup. Marcel Dubois moved among the guests, offering wine with a strained smile, while Evelyn St. Clair sat erect, her eyes fixed on the fire. Clara Wentworth, her notebook clutched tightly, avoided Langston's gaze, her fingers trembling as she sipped her tea. Miss Marple, joining them, noted the dynamics. Langston's isolation, Marcel's forced calm, Evelyn's quiet intensity, and Clara's fear. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but Langston's ambition loomed largest. She recalled Clara's note, Langston's cellar access, and considered its implications. Had Clara seen Langston near the cellar, or overheard something incriminating? Miss Marple approached her, her manner as gentle as a village aunt. "Miss Wentworth," she said, "your notebook must be full of interesting observations. Journalism is such a keen-eyed profession." Clara flushed, her hands tightening on the notebook. "Just notes," she stammered. "Nothing important." But Miss Marple's kind smile coaxed a confession. "I saw Mr. Langston near the cellar door the night before the tasting," Clara whispered. "He was talking to Tom, looking sneaky." Miss Marple nodded, her mind slotting this into place, like the moment in St. Mary Mead when a maid's casual remark had revealed a thief's nighttime movements. Later, Miss Marple joined Harrow in the study, where Tom, the waiter, sat, his face pale and his hands fidgeting. Under gentle questioning, he broke down, tears in his eyes. "Mr. Langston gave me £10, he said. Said to swap Mr. Carver's glass with one he'd prepared. Told me it was just bad wine, to make a fool of him. I didn't know it'd kill him." Harrow's expression hardened, but Miss Marple's remained soft, though her mind was sharp. "In St. Mary Mead," she said to Harrow afterward, "a boy once thought he was playing a prank, but he was a pawn in a larger game. Langston used Tom, I think, to deliver the poison, counting on his innocence to shield him." As night fell, Miss Marple sat by the library fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. The village parallel had clarified the motive, Langston's ambition. To ruin Chateau Vin had led to a desperate act, with Tom as his unwitting tool. The puzzle was nearly complete, but Miss Marple knew the final confrontation would require all her patience, like waiting for a St. Mary Mead gossip to reveal the last piece of a scandal. Chapter 11. The Confrontation, the Grand Tasting Room of Chateau Vin. Its stone walls, still echoing with the memory of Roland Carver's fatal collapse, was now a stage for revelation. Inspector Harrow had gathered the guests and key staff under the pretext of an update, but Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively near a tall candelabrum, sensed the air of a final act. The room's long table, cleared of its crystal glasses, stood bare, and the faint scent of oak and wine lingered, a reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, her hands still, as her sharp eyes took in the assembled company. Marcel Dubois, his lean frame tense; Evelyn St. Clair, her elegance a shield; Clara Wentworth, clutching her notebook like a talisman; and Victor Langston, his ruddy face pale, his robust demeanor fraying at the edges. The waiter, Tom, hovered near the door, his eyes downcast, while constables stood watch, their presence a silent warning. Inspector Harrow stood at the head of the table, his sharp features set with determination. "We have evidence," he began, his voice cutting through the tense silence, "that Roland Carver was poisoned deliberately, through a tempered glass of vin royale. The bottle, hidden behind a barrel, contained the same poison." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. Miss Marple noted the reactions. Marcel's jaw tightened, Evelyn's hands clasped tightly, Clara's breath caught, and Langston's eyes darted to the door. It was not unlike a St. Mary Mead village meeting, where a confrontation over a stolen relic had flushed out the guilty with a single glance. Harrow turned to Miss Marple, a nod acknowledging her quiet influence. "Miss Marple has been most helpful," he said, drawing parallels to cases she's known. "Her insights led us to the bottle and to the truth." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression mild, though her mind was as sharp as ever. She spoke, her voice soft but carrying the weight of certainty. "In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a baker who sabotaged a rival's flour to ruin his trade. The act was simple, but the motive was deep: envy, fear of losing all he had built. Here, at Chateau Vin, I believe we have a similar tale. Mr. Langston sought to destroy this vineyard's reputation, and in doing so, caused Mr. Carver's death." Langston's face reddened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "That's absurd," he blustered, his voice loud but unsteady. "I'm a vintner, not a murderer." The room stirred, but Miss Marple continued, unruffled. "Your vineyard, Langston Vale, has suffered since Chateau Vin's rise. The trade journals spoke of debts, foreclosure looming, a scandal-tainted wine, a ruined tasting would have crushed your rival and restored your fortunes. You paid young Tom to swap Mr. Carver's glass with one from the poisoned bottle, believing, perhaps, that a bad vintage would suffice to disgrace Chateau Vin, but the poison was stronger than you intended. Tom, trembling at the door, let out a sob. "It's true," he cried. "Mr. Langston gave me £10, said it was just bad wine to make Mr. Carver look a fool. I didn't know it'd kill him." Langston surged to his feet, his cigar falling to the floor. "Lies," he roared. "The boy's making it up." But Harrow raised a hand, his voice firm. "We found the bottle, Langston, hidden where you left it. Your fingerprints were on it, and Tom's statement matches the evidence. You had access to the cellar. Clara Wentworth saw you there the night before." Clara gasped, her notebook slipping to the table. "I didn't mean to," she began, but Miss Marple's gentle glance silenced her. "You saw what mattered, my dear," she said softly. "In St. Mary Mead, a girl's stray remark, once unmasked, a thief. Your note about Mr. Langston's cellar visit was the key." Clara's eyes widened, but she nodded, her fear giving way to relief. Harrow stepped forward, a pair of handcuffs gleaming in his hand. "Victor Langston, you're under arrest for the murder of Roland Carver." Langston's defiance crumbled, his shoulders sagging. "I only meant to ruin the wine," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "The poison, it was supposed to sicken, not kill. I got it from a supplier, thought it'd just taint the batch." His confession, raw and reluctant, echoed a St. Mary Mead grocer's admission of tampering with a rival's stock, driven by desperation to save his shop. As the constables led Langston away, the room exhaled. Marcel's face softened, his pride intact but tempered by the ordeal. Evelyn's eyes glistened, her love for the vineyard mingling with grief for its lost master. Clara, her notebook open, began scribbling, her journalistic instincts rekindled. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, felt the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, though her heart held a trace of sadness for the human frailties exposed. Harrow approached her, his notebook closed. "You've a gift, Miss Marple," he said. "We'd have got there, but you saw the pattern first." She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Patterns, Inspector, are everywhere, if one looks closely. St. Mary Mead taught me that." As she rose, the tasting room seemed to lighten, its shadows lifting with the truth unveiled. Chapter 12. The Vineyard's Legacy. The morning sun rose over Chateau Vin, its golden rays bathing the vineyards in a soft glow that seemed to promise renewal. The manor, though still shadowed by the tragedy of Roland Carver's death, buzzed with a quiet resolve as the guests prepared to depart. Miss Jane Marple stood on the terrace, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting tucked into a small bag at her side. The air carried the faint sweetness of ripening grapes, and she gazed out at the orderly rows of vines, their leaves shimmering with dew. The scene reminded her of St. Mary Mead, after a scandal had been laid to rest, life resuming, like a garden, after a storm, with roots still strong beneath the surface. Inside, the drawing room was a hive of subdued activity. Inspector Harrow, his investigation concluded with Victor Langston's arrest, was overseeing the final statements, his sharp efficiency softened by a nod of gratitude toward Miss Marple as she entered. The guests, no longer suspects, moved with a mix of relief and solemnity. Marcel Dubois, his lean frame less rigid now, was arranging bottles for a small farewell tasting, his pride in his craft undimmed by the ordeal. Evelyn St. Clair, her silver hair catching the light, stood by a window, her posture erect but her eyes softer, as if the vineyard's future weighed on her anew. Clara Wentworth, her notebook filled with the story of Langston's plot, scribbled furiously, her nervous energy transformed into purpose. Miss Marple, observing them, felt the familiar satisfaction of a puzzle solved. though tinged with the melancholy of human folly. Evelyn approached her, a faint smile on her lips. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice steady but warm, "you've done us a great service. Chateau Vin might have been ruined without your insight." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression mild. "I only saw what was there, Mrs. St. Clair," she said. "In St. Mary Mead, I've learned that truth, like a good vintage, needs only time to surface." Evelyn nodded, her gaze drifting to the vineyards. "I'm taking charge of the estate," she said. "Roland's vision was ambitious, but I'll ensure the vines endure, as they always have." Her words carried a quiet strength, and Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Dane Calthrop, who had rebuilt her life after a village scandal, her pride rooted in resilience. Marcel, overhearing, joined them, a bottle of vin royal in hand. "Mademoiselle Marple," he said, his French accent softened by gratitude, "I was wrong to doubt your eye. You saw what I could not." He poured a glass, offering it to her. "A toast to clarity." Miss Marple accepted with a smile, sipping sparingly. "To the vineyard's legacy," she said, and Marcel's mustache twitched with approval. She noted his newfound humility, a contrast to his earlier pride, and recalled a St. Mary Mead baker who had learned modesty after a misstep. Marcel, she sensed, would craft finer wines for it. Clara, her article nearly complete, approached shyly, her notebook tucked under her arm. "Miss Marple, I've written the truth about what happened," she said, her voice steadier now. "Your help made it possible. I was so afraid to speak up." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "My dear, courage comes in its own time," she said. "In St. Mary Mead, a young girl once held a secret that saved a family's honor. You've done much the same." Clara blushed, her confidence bolstered, and Miss Marple saw in her the makings of a journalist who would grow bolder with each story. Beatrice Harrow bustled over, her burgundy dress rustling. "Jane, you're a marvel," she exclaimed. "Harrow says you're sharper than his best men. You must visit again without all this unpleasantness." Miss Marple smiled, her thoughts already turning to her quiet cottage. "Perhaps," she said, knowing that St. Mary Mead's dramas, though smaller, were no less compelling. As the guests prepared to leave, Miss Marple took a final walk through the vineyards, her steps slow on the gravel paths. The vines, resilient, despite the storm of human ambition, stretched toward the horizon, their legacy secure in Evelyn's hands. Langston's plot had failed, his attempt to ruin Chateau Vin undone by his own overreach. Much like a St. Mary Mead grocer whose sabotage had collapsed under scrutiny. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was a patient vintner, coaxing clarity from chaos. Returning to the manor, she found Inspector Harrow waiting by the motor car that would take her to the station. "You've left your mark, Miss Marple," he said, a rare smile breaking through his stern demeanor. "Chateau Vin owes you." She shook her head, her knitting bag in hand. "I only listened, Inspector," she said. "People, like villages, tell their own stories if one pays attention." As the car pulled away, Miss Marple glanced back at the manor, its stone walls aglow in the sunlight. She would return to St. Mary Mead, where her garden and her neighbors awaited, each with their own secrets to unfold, as rich and complex as any vineyard's vintage.